Good evening, everybody. It's a great satisfaction to be here in New York. I hope that this evening can be valuable to all of us, as it has been for me and for my wife, Jenny. And we're really privileged to be here with you all. Today's topic for our reflection tonight has to do with the virtues of the Sermon of the Mount. This passage of Jesus' life has become known as the heart of the gospel. The gospel is already a fantastic deposit of teachings. It's a heart in and of itself. If we could choose what's the heart of the heart, perhaps we could say that the Sermon of the Mount is such. The passage that Jesus presents to us, the Beatitudes, this can be for us a guide, a model, a roadmap of moral behavior. Gandhi once said, in an opportunity in his life, that if all the books, all the sacred texts were lost, but only the Sermon of the Mount was left, nothing would be lost. Because the moral teaching for humankind, the essential, is all contained within the Sermon of the Mount. Some years ago, we had the opportunity to write a book, which is available here, which is called The Code of the Mount, which is a study about what virtues did Jesus present to us in each one of the Beatitudes. The Beatitudes in the Sermon of the Mount are precisely the moments during which he highlights each and every one of those qualities. They are contained in all the teachings of his life with us, but they are synthesized, summarized in the Sermon of the Mount. In my activity as a psychiatrist, and also as a practicing spiritist who was born into a spiritist family, always called my attention that as we develop moral aspects in our lives, some situations that are of an emotional nature, they unravel in a different way if we were not to do anything about them, in such a way that our life is completely different if we invest in the ethic, morality, and spirituality versus not doing that. It's notorious with our patients that the people that seek to get to know themselves more, that seek to develop themselves internally, they show qualities that are specific of more general and broad development compared to those people who take life being less occupied, less prepared, a little more distracted, so to speak, from those factors. When we wrote this book, it caught my attention the following. Every time we write a book, it's a presentation of something that we were thinking about before. But at the time of writing, new ideas come to mind which we hadn't thought of before. So it's a curious phenomenon. This even happens at a lecture when we are talking, and the way we articulate the rationale or our reasoning, our thoughts, sometimes it's surprising for us to realize some new ideas come. In fact, I'd like to make you feel at ease that at any time you wish to make any questions or to leave them in the end so that we can make this evening more interactive and more pleasant as an experience for all of us. So when I wrote this book, something was highlighted like a series of insights and perceptions which I had not thought of before, like that the virtues that Jesus brings to us in the Sermon of the Mount they have, in a way, not in a radical or in a stiff way, but they provide us a possibility to think that from the first to the eighth beatitude, he proposes to us a code of moral development. It shows as a roadmap for our inner evolution. So, what are the Beatitudes so that we can get into the subject? He said the following: Blessed are those who are poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are the afflicted, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek and peace-loving, for those will inherit the earth. Blessed are those that are hungry and thirst for righteousness, because they will be filled. Blessed are those who are merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are those who are pure of heart, or the clean of heart, because they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. And lastly, blessed are those who are persecuted for love of justice, because theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So there we go. 8 of them. Let's go one by one. Number 1, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Jesus calls poor in spirit, or poor in the spirit sense, those who are detached from external glories, who are removed from external glories, those who are poor from the external richness, but who cultivate interior qualities. He's referring to the humble ones. In all of Jesus' life, it's a call for us to develop this virtue of humility, which is essential. And it's interesting to think that what he does already back in the day, in his time, is very important, especially to our days. This virtue, humility, is a very forgotten one. Even to this day, it's almost not perceptible as a quality. We see in the world that the great quality is to be valued, is to show themselves, to be successful, to develop. And Jesus says the opposite. Blessed are those who are poor in spirit, because theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And if we think about it from a mental perspective, psychological, emotional perspective, we're going to notice that this has a profound wisdom in it. Why? Because if the first virtue is humility, without humility, we can't propose to look at our inner selves. All the developments of our qualities and our potentialities, they first have to go through this virtue. For instance, to get to know ourselves. Only those who are humble is one who commits themselves to getting to know themselves. The vain, proud individual, they really don't look at themselves. When facing a challenge in life, he will never look at himself. If there's a complicated situation, the blame is never his. The blame is placed on somebody else. Unless you have this first virtue, which is humility, to look at myself. Perhaps I may have some blame in this. That's humility. In the Portuguese language, but let's see if in English, hopefully as well, humility comes from humus, which comes from the same radical as humanity. And humus means earth, soil. So if humility has a connection with humanity, and humanity means soil, then our first virtue is the one that connects us with earth, is the one that makes us human, is the one that makes us all the same. If I can't consider myself equal to other people, then I don't have humus. Therefore, I don't have humanity. then therefore I can start from the beginning, which is the development of humility. Humility is the virtue that puts us all on the same plane. We are all the same. There are no differences from ethnicities or values. We only belong to the same race, the human race. Therefore, we are the same. We are born in the same manner. We will leave the earth, either poor or rich. We're going to leave. Nobody stays. Everybody goes. Everybody comes here in the same way. If nobody takes care of us when we're little, then we die. All of us. No difference. So we go through the same processes, internal processes. If we do a blood work, there's no way to distinguish if they're black, white, yellow. There's no way. We're from the same race. So this requires of us this humus, this humanity, therefore. So the essential virtue of the first step in this evolutionary step ladder is the development of humility. Humility is perhaps the most important virtue of Jesus, without which we cannot acquire the other ones. It's such a splendid virtue that it doesn't announce itself. Those that are humble don't know that they are humble. People don't notice. It's some of those virtues that cannot be proclaimed, and some others perhaps we can have. But the virtue as a virtue is usually silent, quiet. But humility is the most silent of all of them. If the person arrives and says, I'm a doctor, psychiatrist, Brazilian, I'm a student, all of this I'm talking about myself, but I am also humble. I'm already saying that I am something that I'm not. It's a virtue that doesn't present itself. It cannot show itself. A person who's humble never proclaims that they are humble. This can be understood in our lives in many situations when we overestimate ourselves, when we think that we are better than others. We're distant from this first virtue that Jesus teaches us. Is everyone humble here? Maybe? So after this, we can't really tell, right? We have to remain quiet, because if you say you are, then we have an issue. Which is this Christian behavior pattern. The life of Jesus is precisely a teaching of humility. He presents himself as such. This, since the way of behaving is simplicity, but mainly in his relationships with other people. If we examine his life, we'll notice that he didn't really like, it seems, to live amongst the powerful one of the earth. Whenever he presented himself, who was a doctor of the law, or somebody who had a social value that was greater, if we notice those passages, he doesn't waste a second to call their attention and to strip them of those credentials which the Pharisees or doctors of the law would present themselves with. But whenever someone who's being humiliated, or a prostitute, or someone who's considered of less value, or a Samaritan, for example, he would exalt them. He would immediately put them up. So he would immediately present them, that those were the ones who truly had some kind of a credential, let's put it this way, which placed them in a plane of higher value, which is the moral values. So here we notice a counterpoint in our life that we lead. What's the value of a person which has a virtue such as this one, humility, the capacity to look inward? What is the validity? What's the opportunity? In which manner do we have some kind of a gain as a result of this. The first gain is a psychological gain. The people that are more simple, more humble, they are therefore less arrogant, less prideful, less vain. Those people, they position themselves better in the environments, they have better relationships. They're also the people that are able to ask for help when they need it. Whoever works in medicine and in psychology, we notice this a lot, that the more proud individuals, they rarely admit that they need help themselves. Normally, there are people who say, I don't need help. They can be very sick, but they still say that the other people are sick, that they are not sick. And as a result, they get sicker, quicker, and die earlier. Statistics show that the more arrogant people, they tend to get sick quicker because they're subject to the same processes as everybody else, but they have less medical assistance, less psychological assistance, and even less spiritual assistance. To get to a person and say, hey, let's go to a spiritist house or to do a study to try to improve ourselves. Me? No, not me. That's not for me. That's for the weak. So Jesus came for those who are the weak, and he says, these are the strong ones. Because when somebody admits that they have such limitations in their hummus, in their humanity, he becomes able to live within a moral quality that will take him to other advantages from a spiritual point of view. Blessed are those who are afflicted, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the afflicted. Jesus says that those who suffer are blessed. So we think, what's the virtue of the afflicted? Is affliction, is pain, is suffering, are in and of themselves virtues? Or is suffering, affliction, is an instrument to develop in us a type of virtue? We think the latter is more appropriate because it doesn't seem that suffering is a virtue. It's not. So much so that people that suffer, and the more that they suffer, the more they become rebellious. We have examples of cultures, collective examples of wars that are unending, of peoples that promote suffering in other peoples, and then those peoples seek revenge, and they become, in centuries, fighting with each other. The more they suffer, more hatred. The more hatred, more revenge, more suffering, and that never ends. So the affliction, suffering in and of itself, it's not a virtue, but they can become instruments for us to develop other virtues. What we're going to do with that suffering, with that affliction, is going to determine that we are developing ourselves spiritually. And what is the virtue that we can develop during an affliction? Seems to be resignation, the ability to accept. Certain moments in our life, we have two paths. Either we fight with such situations in our life, or we accept that situation and we learn with it. We develop ourselves inwardly. Some time ago, I discovered the difference between problem and situation. And that's an essential difference to understand between problem and situation. When we have a difficulty in our life and we have a solution for that difficulty, then there is something within our power that we can do to solve it. Then we have a problem. Example, I have a financial difficulty, but if I work more, I'll be able to solve it. So I have a financial problem. Financial problem will depend on my ability of work, effort, competence, in order to solve that difficulty. So that's a problem. But there's another type of challenge, which is when we have, for example, a loss, or somebody in our life and our family dies. Now we have a situation, because after this, there's nothing we can do to reverse that fact. It's definitive. We have a happening which escapes our action, and there's nothing we can do about it. That's a situation. That's different from a problem, because the problem depends upon us to solve it. In a situation when we don't have anything to do objectively, we can only do something in us, within us, in order to face that challenge. This is very important to distinguish. I learned this with a person who, after being shot, was handicapped. And after a year, inside a hospital bed, lamenting and complaining and saying to herself and to God, "Why me, why me, why me?" He finally came to his senses that he could spend the rest of his life beyond this difficulty, which is already tough, with another suffering, which is the non-acceptance. Every time that we don't accept a situation that is permanent, we increase suffering. And so he discovered the following, that he was happy before he was shot. So all he had left was try to go back to being happy again, despite his physical limitation that he would have. And he was able to do that. He became the first person in a wheelchair in Brazil that began to play basketball. And also he launched the tennis game for wheelchair people. So he said something very interesting. If this had not happened to him, he probably wouldn't have exalted himself in this situation. As a doctor, he became a specialist in pathology, one of the biggest pathologists in Brazil. He wanted to be a cardiologist, but when he was shot, he had to stop from this preference, because this cardiology profession was much harder to become a part of. So he chose a specialty which allowed him to develop easier. And when we were talking once, he told me he wasn't thankful of the criminal who shot him. He wasn't happy because of that, but he realized that in a way, that bullet made him a person with more resources in many ways than if that had not happened to him. This is a virtue that's called resilience. Resilience. In such a situation, we can choose two paths. Either we break down and become nothing, or we seek something to do something about it, and later develop other qualities. Blessed are the afflicted, for they will be comforted. They will be comforted in many ways. In the first process that Jesus says consolation, it's an inner process, the resilience. Another virtue that develops in these cases is the ability for empathy. Why empathy? Because empathy only comes when I am able to identify in somebody something that I know what it's like, because I have already come through it, or there's a mental representation inside of me. And in order to represent this internally, this aspect of suffering, it's important invariably that we have to go through it in a suffering. So empathy, which is a virtue that's so scarce in our days, as we see in many urban centers and cities, and you live in one of the biggest ones in the world, you'll notice that the majority of the human collectivities that live in more comfortable situations, they have a tendency to not care as much for one another. There's more a cooling off of relationships. Relationships are cooler. Sometimes we're half a foot from somebody, but kilometers away affectionately from another person. Sometimes we're inside the same home, the same family, and miles away affectionately, especially after the iPhones and phones, smartphones that connect us very quickly with distant people and very quickly disconnect us from our nearest ones. We connect ourselves to the world, but disconnect ourselves from our world. So empathy, which is this virtue, this quality, or this ability, psychological and moral, it will come about normally before painful circumstances. This is why that in occasions when tragedies occur, this mobilizes populations to take actions that are solidarity, because it's as if the human being would only awaken to this level of moral quality upon facing such situations. We're still like that. We need pain in order to awaken ourselves into love. We still need suffering in order to realize that we are alive. The insensitivity of an affectionate nature, it comes from, sometimes, from the comfort of our relationships. What do we mean by comfort? It's this condition where we don't have any needs that we so seek so much, that we try to satiate, quench the desires, and create circumstances in our life of absence of any conflict, absence of emotional conflict, absence of pain, which this is a natural search of the human being for us to be happier, can also become a dangerous instrument when we don't realize that this distances us from one another until something happens, which then takes us to have more loving or actions of solidarity. And it's quite common that when this happens, the individual looks at himself and says, wow, I liked going through this experience, or I feel better as a person when or after going through suffering, when I could show to myself somebody who has a moral ability. So Jesus will say, blessed are the afflicted, for they will be comforted. When we wrote this book, we were almost halfway through it, and we began to notice that there lies a curious coincidence in this ascensions of virtues, in the climbing of the mount, because it's as if we're climbing a mountain. From the base of the mountain to the apex, to the summit. If we think, what's the base of our chakras? chakras, of our centers of force.
Qual é o primeiro chakra?
Which one is the first chakra or
É o
center of
chamado
force?
chakra da raiz.
It's called the root chakra, the basic chakra, correct?
O chakra básico é
The
o que nos
root
liga à
chakra
terra.
is what connects us
É
to
o que
the
nos liga ao
earth,
humus.
is what connects us to
É o que nos
humus,
torna humanos.
is what makes us
É o que
human,
nos planta
is
na
what
terra.
firmly grounds us
É o que nos
or
nutre da
plants
nossa
us to the
materialidade
earth.
mais
It's
primitiva.
what nourishes us from our primitive materiality. So the first beatitude, blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the afflicted, brings us this connection of this humanity and activates the first chakra. When we begin to climb in the higher levels and we arrive to blessed are the afflicted, we begin to see a slightly higher level, which is the umbilical cord chakra, which has to do with our sexual potentialities and also our afflictions that we feel. So it seems that there is a connection. I invite you to think with me together that as we develop virtues, we begin to go from energetic levels that also exist in our fields of centers of force. See how interesting that is. He will say, blessed are the meek and peace-loving. Blessed are the meek and peace-loving, because those will possess the earth. And he will say right next, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, because they will be filled. And really, the meek and peace-loving, Jesus is referring to being meek, which is a virtue that comes right after the moment that we become able to endure our afflictions, our pains. If a person is enduring an affliction and they become rebellious, they lose their meekness. If they become accepting, if they have resignation, then they become appeased, serene, because then they no longer need to carry this burden of these problems. So when he says, blessed are the meek and peace-loving, for they will inherit the earth, it seems to me that he's saying, to interpret what he's saying, is a lack of humility, but I'm going to be bold here. It's a reasoning exercise so that we can extract a lesson for us. And Jesus, of course, meant much more. But when he says, blessed are the meek and peace-loving, because they will inherit the earth, he's showing us that we inherit the territory. What's the territory? The inner territory, the inner earth, the earth of our feelings. When I become appeased, serene, I possess myself. If I become rebellious, I am possessed by my rebelliousness. If I despair, if I hate, if I don't forgive, if I seek revenge, I am possessed by feelings that begin to dominate every day of my life. If I become appeased and if I accept, then I don't care about those dense emotions. So I am blessed because I possess the earth. I possess myself. I possess my emotions. It's one of the most difficult things in our life to possess our emotions. We are normally possessed by our emotions. We are possessed by sadness, by anxiety, by pain, by guilt. The soil, the earth of the feelings that possess us. But he tells us it is possible that we can appease ourselves internally. We can then inherit the earth, possess ourselves, so that we can arrive to blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, because they will be filled. Who has hunger and thirst for justice or righteousness? When he says justice, he means those situations of our life.
Fome e sede lembra que
Hunger
chakra
and thirst reminds us of what chakra, what center of force?
gasto, né? Fome
The digestive
é o
chakra.
básico. Ele está falando do
He's
nível
talking
plexo
about
solar,
the solar
que
plexus,
é exatamente aonde
which is
se
exactly
estabelecem as
where
angústias.
the main anguishes are established. At this
Que é o
level,
nível terceiro,
which is the
vamos dizer,
third level,
nosso-
so to
da nossa
speak,
escala de
in our
ascendência energética,
energetic
nós
ascension,
estamos já na
we are
posse de
already
três
in
virtudes
possession of three virtues:
essenciais, que é a
essential,
humildade,
which is humility,
resignação e
resignation,
mansuetude.
and meekness.
Vejam,
Notice,
esse é um exercício para
this
pensar
is
no
an
nosso-
exercise for us to think about
É
it.
roteiro.
It's a roadmap.
Podemos usar vários roteiros.
We can
Não é
use many
um roteiro,
roadmaps.
é
It's not
um roteiro.
the, it's just one roadmap. It's just a way of thinking.
Mas como eu percebi esse assunto
But since I noticed this in the following way: humility,
resignação,
resignation,
mansuetude.
and meekness, those three virtues,
É trabalho que
is
a
a
gente pode
work that
fazer
we can develop
com a gente mesmo.
with ourselves, within ourselves. These are personal virtues.
Humildade é
Humility,
sou eu comigo mesmo.
it's me with myself. Meekness is me with myself. Resignation is me with myself. But blessed are those who hunger and thirst,
Ele está nos falando
and they will be filled. Now he's talking about being nourished.
gastricamente.
From a digestive point of view,
Está
no.
nos falando de nós sermos alimentados
Being nourished in a different way, a different type of nutrient,
que é um nutriente
which is the spiritual
Então,
nourishment.
diante das
So,
dores,
when we are facing pain and suffering, Jesus proposes that we make a connection with someone beyond ourselves. And that's where
a fé é
faith
exatamente
comes in.
uma virtude,
Faith is a virtue, is a quality of our
que
psychic
nós
life,
sabermos na nossa
which is
vida,
to
muitas
realize, to
vezes,
know in our
nós
life,
podemos resolver as
many
coisas
times we can
sozinhos.
take care of things on our
Mas
own.
existem outros momentos
But there are other
que nós
times
sozinhos somos
when
insuficientes.
we ourselves are
Nós precisamos de algo
insufficient,
além de nós.
that we need
Nós
someone,
precisamos de uma força
something
além de nós.
beyond us,
Então ele
a
propõe
greater power.
no seu evangelho
So
de
he
amor,
suggests in his loving
nós
gospel
podemos ter uma parceria,
that we can have a
uma
partnership,
parceria com o Pai,
a partnership
uma
with the
parceria com
Father,
Deus,
a partnership with
uma
God,
parceria com
a
uma
partnership
força amorosa.
with a loving
Ele
force.
passou nos ensinando isso a
So he
vida toda,
begins,
porque
so he
nós
taught that his entire life, because he himself
compôs
constantly
o seu evangelho
composed his gospel as a spiritual connection with a good and just
e é assim
Father.
que nesses instantes
So it is in
nós
this way
estamos
that in our lives we
vendo
see
que nós realmente só somos
that we
fortes
really are
em
strong
determinados momentos,
in certain
quando nós nos
situations
apoiamos
when we
em uma
rely
força além de nós.
in a strength, in a power that's greater than ourselves. We've all gone through it.
Qual de nós no passou por um
Who
momento
has not gone through a difficult situation
precisou
which needed
ou sentiu
or
necessidade
felt the need
de recorrer
to rely on some superior force or some help that was greater than? We're halfway.
Estamos subindo uma
We're
montanha.
climbing the
Já
mountain.
chegamos no
So
nível
we've already arrived at an intermediary point where we already have a connection with ourselves and we're opening gradually to others halfway through the mountain. I ask you,
Vocês querem dar uma paradinha para descansar?
would you like a break to rest?
Estão cansados?
Are you tired from the climb?
Vamos tomar um líquido.
Shall we have some water?
A montanha costuma dar uma sede danada. Saúde.
Cheers.
Alguma pergunta?
Any questions? Any comments?
Já não perceberam muitas
Have you
vezes
noticed that sometimes
na vida da gente
in our life
nós temos uma
we have
falta de fôlego
a lack
diante de determinadas situações?
of strength and before a certain situation we feel like we can't cope with it
Essa não
anymore.
precisava.
Like, man, I didn't really need this one.
Essa foi forte.
That was strong. I couldn't handle it.
Logo comigo, né?
Oh man, with me, of all people,
Falta o fôlego.
I can't cope. It's like climbing a mountain. We tread, we hike. When we get halfway through it, we lack some air.
Essa
When
metáfora ela é
This metaphor is interesting because our life is like, the moral life is like a climb. Whoever wants to climb morally, inevitably will find some situation that seems that we're not going to have enough air. So the next situation is the one that announces this great difficulty. Blessed are those who are merciful. That was a tough one. Blessed are the merciful, because they will be shown mercy. Mercy. In Portuguese, misery plus cord, heart. Misery plus heart has this ability to comprehend, understand the misery of others, to understand the limitation of our fellow man, of our neighbor, and not just to understand, but to forgive. What's the chakra that's associated with this level? The heart chakra is the next energetic level. Do you realize, blessed are those who are hungry and thirst for righteousness? Mercy is the heart chakra. Do you think that's a coincidence? Do you think that was a coincidence? Do you think that was random? Do you think this equivalency is just a mere, just a fortuitous, arbitrary, or perhaps there is a deeper meaning here? From a psychic point of view, it makes a lot of sense. I can only find God in this connection of faith if I have the ability to connect with others in what they have as a good thing, but also in the things that disappoint me, in what He does against me. So at this level, the connection is no longer personal, and it becomes a connection with the neighbor. For the first time, the other appears in our evolutionary level. It's not just me, myself, relating with myself, but me relating with the other. And this relating with the other is to have a relationship with the other as another, as a other. What do I mean? Many times we have a relationship with others, but the others are not others. The others are an extension of us. We would like them to be that which we expect them to be. That's not having a relationship with others. That's having a relationship with oneself. Every time I want my wife to be a certain way, and she's right here, and she doesn't correspond to my expectations, and I get rebellious, is because I don't accept her to be different than me. Every time a child does something or says something different than what I accept, and I become rebellious, is because I don't accept that he is himself, that he is a other. And that's the great crisis of the family, of relationships, and I don't need to tell you, of the international relations with nations, when cultures don't accept one another, don't tolerate themselves. They are not merciful in the meaning of having this ability of cordiality in the relationships. Then we then establish a fundamentalism, which is very narcissistic. The great fundamentalism in the world is the pathological narcissism, which is to not allow ourselves to accept that other people are different, other races, other thoughts. We just don't accept that. So if they don't think the way I think, they're out. They're not worth it. So then I establish a rule in my life that in order to fit, they need to follow an extension of me, of who I am. And Jesus says, blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. We always think about this virtue like a very grave, tough situation that we have to forgive. But from an emotional perspective, there's not necessarily need to be something big. Just requires us to be relating with other people. And of course, forgiveness is a great virtue. If we are not able to forgive, if we can't have compassion, the Buddhists love this virtue. In Christianity, piety, mercy. In Buddhism, it's compassion. They're very they're segments of the same quality, which is the ability to see the other and to have that feeling of solidarity towards him, even if that strips me from my point of view, from what I'm feeling, from what I'm able to accept. This is why Jesus in this moment proposes a great challenge, which is for us to go beyond the limits of our ego. It's already a virtue that the person who has it, they go beyond themselves. Now I'm running out of air even more. It's getting tough to breathe. It's beating harder here. It's like that. Any question? Or are we going to leave it to the end? If we can get there. Let's climb a little higher. From what do we have here? Throat. Larynx. The throat chakra is responsible for our spontaneity, ability for communication, to be natural, to be spontaneous, to be authentic, to breathe, to cleanse ourselves of our adultness, adult-like things. The excessive adultness that we have in us. Jesus says, let the little children come to me, because the kingdom of heaven is to those who are like the children. So what's the virtue that he's talking about? Blessed are the cleansed, the pure of heart, because they will see God. The pure or clean that Jesus is referring to is the ones that are like children in the virtue of purity, of cleanliness, of spontaneity, which we lose in a very quick way. We become adults too much when it comes to taking things too seriously, rigorously, and with that, we don't communicate anymore in an affectionate way, in the same way that children communicate. How do children communicate with one another? Playing. And how do we communicate? Fighting. Right? Or we don't talk, we just remain distant. Either we're distant, or when we communicate, we fight. And children play. Children play. It's human nature, this potentiality of playing, to be spontaneous, to be eloquent, to be natural. It's amazing how we've been losing gradually a quality that is essential since being children, which is the ability to smile. 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 Please, smile. To smile is a natural ability. When we see a child and we look at them, she doesn't know who we are. Sometimes it's even dangerous in an adult, and the child opens up beautifully. That's enough to be a spontaneous attitude, and the child is receptive to this stimulus, this human stimulus. During our growth, our development, we create a certain barrier to those emotions. We become hardened. We become suspicious of one another. So we live a moment of a lot of suspicion. That's very serious from a mental perspective.
Talvez a gente esteja nesse
Maybe in
momento
this
no
moment
lugar
we are in the place in the world
as
where
pessoas estejam mais
people
desconfiadas,
are most suspicious
com razão,
with good
das
reason.
ameaças de ataques.
Be- with the threats, terrorist threats, anyone
Isso
can be a
faz com que eu me
threat.
distancie,
This makes me become more distant,
com que eu queira me defender,
makes me want to
mas isso é
defend
um
myself.
adoecimento.
But that's a disease.
Infelizmente, nós caminhamos
Unfortunately,
numa direção
we walk in a
contrária
direction that's
daquilo que era natural do ser
opposing
humano. Jesus
to
diz
what is
assim,
opposite, to what is natural. And Jesus says, blessed are those that don't need to feel that, because when we trust, we become lighter. We play, we resume playing, we go back to trusting one another. If we can't trust a stranger, we can at least train the trust of our fellow man, because this trust has entered the house. The husbands don't, the spouses don't trust each other. Children don't trust each other. Siblings don't trust one another. And in our Spiritist family, the same thing. We lost faith and trust with one another. We become suspicious. And Jesus says, guys, come on, let's set this free. Let's work these aspects. If I'm living with somebody in my life, then I need to trust. Let's practice trust. It's natural for us, human beings, to seek and wish trust. I don't know how long we will need to suffer in order to realize that at the crucial moment, we will have a vocation to help one another mutually, to be good, to be human, to exercise solidarity, to trust one another. And this feeling is encapsulated inside of us. It seems that it's currently being stirred a lot by the intense pain and that we are experiencing before many difficult facts that we're facing in life. I hope us as a humanity don't need to go through greater catastrophes than we are already going through, so that we can go back to being children. We really need to go back to what is most precious in us, and hopefully we don't need those catastrophes, that we may be able to resume to have trust and stimulate one another. Human beings are very sensitive to smile, of being funny and good-natured, good sense of humor. I'd like to give an example. Some time ago, I used to live in a place in my city, and near my house, there was a man, a young man, who was a hairdresser. And he was always in his shop, was always empty, for a very simple reason. He would shoo everybody away, because he was so hardened, so closed to himself, that when somebody tried to talk to him, he would try everything for the person not to like him. So he was very closed. He was a difficult person. We would call a person rude. We want to be distant. So when I used to go to work, I always go in front of his store, and he'd be sitting there in front of the store because he didn't have anything to do. He never said hi to me. He would look at me and he would turn his face away. He would turn his face, I turn my face too, which is a very normal attitude, right? We like those that like us, but those who demonstrate any opposing reaction, we have a tendency to have a resistance. He would turn his face, I turn my face. So then something created. When we go through a person once, twice, 3 times, and we don't say hi, is normal. But after the 7th, 10th, 11th time, we begin to feel an obligation to say good morning. But there was none of that. So I made a decision. Let's end with that. So I didn't cut my hair necessarily, but I began to say, I'm going to say good morning to him. So I would go the first time. I look at him and said, good morning. And he looked away. I said, I'm never going to say good morning to him again. I was insulted. I felt offended. That's so rude. When we say good morning, the person turns the other way. So at the end of the day, he was sitting there. I just passed right by him.
Ele está me convencendo que
He's
eu vou colocar o
convincing me
meu.
that
Eu vou
his way
deixar
is
ele
better than
insistir.
mine. So I insisted.
É assim.
The spirit is it's persuasive.
Pedi uma ajudinha a Jesus,
So I asked Jesus for some help.
certamente não se importaria
And
de
Jesus wouldn't mind about this kind of thing, unlike me. So the next day I was there. I went by him. I said, "Good morning."
nada.
Nothing.
Eu digo, eu vou dizer
I said, "I'm going to say good morning all the time. If he doesn't answer, that's his problem. I'm going to say good morning."
Mas eu percebi uma coisa.
But I noticed something.
Quando eu ia me aproximando,
When I was getting closer to him and he was sitting like a few feet away
ele já
from me,
estava olhando para
he was
mim,
already
esperando que eu
eager,
desse bom dia.
waiting for me to say good morning to him.
Embora ele não desse
Although
bom
he
dia,
wouldn't
ele estava olhando
wish
assim.
good morning to me, he was already
Até
looking
que
at
um
me.
dia,
Until one day, I told him good morning.
e ele não conseguiu dizer
And he
bom
wasn't
dia.
able to say good
Mas ele
morning to
tinha um
me,
som na garganta.
but he had a sound. He made a sound with his throat.
Eu digo, "Olha, ele tá
I was like, wow, he's opening his throat chakra. It was very closed. Good morning. Good morning, he said. All right, that's almost a dog already. He's barking at something.
saiu um grunhido,
Like a,
som
like a very...
E ele já começou a
So he
emitir som.
began to emit sounds after that. Look how interesting.
Até que
Until one day,
ele começou a
he began to greet me, good morning as well.
E não posso dizer, eu também não
And
falo com
I didn't go to cut my hair with him, but
Mas nós nos
we
tornamos
became
amistosos.
like friendly. He was courteous and began to answer. And I thought to myself,
Que esta é uma
this is a difficulty that we have in our lives because we usually wait for people to be like that with us so that we can then show our best to them. Isn't that right?
quando a proposta de
When
Jesus é
the
exatamente ao
proposal of
contrário,
Jesus is exactly the opposite, is for us to be that first, regardless of how people are, because people desire for us to be like that.
num ambiente como o nosso,
In our environment that we are here today, if we are courteous and kind and truly
afáveis uns com os outros,
affectionate with one another, we're going to
estimular essa
stimulate
mesma
the
reação
same reaction
nos sentimentos.
in the feelings of everyone.
E isso faz
And
diferença
this makes a huge difference in our emotional life, in our relationships, and in our spiritual attunement. Because our attunements, spiritual attunements, they establish themselves as a result of our emotional states that we cultivate, our states of being. And so, Jesus arrives at a moment of blessed are the pure of heart, for they shall see God. He presents us with a greater challenge, which is very important. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. The peacemaker is the one who acts in the direction of peace, who makes something. And to do something of the peacemaker means to act where there is conflict, where there is antagonisms, where there is difficulty of opposition, of resistance. So the virtue that is implied here in this process is exactly love. The peacemaker is the one who acts lovingly, especially through his thoughts, because the peacemaking begins first in our thoughts. Peace first begins within us. For me to be a peacemaker, in order to appease myself and to be a peacemaker for the world, I need to think lovingly, think positively. I need to act through my mind in my daily life in this action. Climbing a little more, we have our frontal chakra, which is the center of force for our thinking, for the thinking of a change, of a paradigm, and a aspect of acting and being, which is towards the direction of a world that I want for myself. And this is the attitude that all those we know in humanity's history who went beyond themselves and were able to throw themselves in the direction of their neighbors. It's not enough for the person to have good intentions. It's necessary that they can cultivate thoughts, cultivate positive thoughts, peaceful thoughts in his day, appeasing emotions, appeasing feelings, appeasing the relationships in the world we live in. We have examples of people like that. Famous people, and people who became well known for their virtues, but also in the simple people, unknowns that we live with every day. People who are capable of making arrangements, or sensitive or delicate arrangements in situations and relationships. We notice that. And people who like to complicate relationships. A problem comes and a person throws more wood into the fire, so that becomes a greater problem. And then there's the other person who is a peacemaker, who's able to appease the feelings and emotions. Because when I appease, then thoughts come, dialogue, the ability to comprehend. And so we finally come to the top of the mountain. There where the crown chakra is, our greater level, the chakra that connects us with our absolute transcendence. And Jesus will say, blessed are those who were persecuted for love of justice, because theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Those who are persecuted for the love of justice are those who are actively working through the virtue, through this virtue, through the greatest virtue, which is the one that is able to unite love to all of the other virtues that we've mentioned before, is love in action. What is this virtue of love in action? Which is the one that's without there's no salvation? Charity. It's beautiful. Because Jesus will say that those people that are persecuted for love of justice are precisely the ones who do something. When we nourish ourselves from this greater feeling and we go towards the direction of the works and the deeds and the facts and the movements that we need to be inserted and allied with, then we are opening ourselves up in a superior way, which is that of charity. Charity is this virtue that places us in contact with something far beyond us, with potentialities far beyond ours. When we are able to act in the world beyond our own strengths, in a divine partnership, in a transcendental partnership, it's those people who have within themselves the inner Christ, are capable of producing works, of having behaviors, of actions in the world that go beyond the common. Every time we are greater than ourselves, every time we're capable of goodness or kindness that even surprises ourselves, in those moments we're not alone. We're being supplied by a greater strength. We're being helped by the spiritual support of great souls that come to our aid and give us resources and potentialities that we didn't know we had. That's when we're able to forgive. That's when we're able to become resignated, accepting. We're able to appease. It's when we're able to do charity. From the base to the summit of the mountain, an invitation to progress. The climb of the mount represents the ascension of the spirit that we need and we should employ in our personal journey. It's also a energetic development exercise of our conditions,
entendermos a mensagem
maybe a
de
way of
Jesus
understanding
hoje,
the
por um
message of
caminho
Jesus,
que nos
perhaps
dê
through
a
a path that
capacidade
gives us the
de
ability
vermos que nós
to
temos
see
como entender,
that we have
como
how
compreender
we
e
can
como
understand
desenvolver
how
a
to
nossa vida
employ and how
do
to
jeito diferente que
develop
nós
our
queremos.
lives in a different way.
Era isso que eu tinha pensado dizer para
That's what I
vocês
thought of sharing with
no
you
tema
all
de hoje,
in tonight's
mas eu
topic.
gostaria muito de
But I
ouvi-los
would love to hear your input.
e de poder
I
ajudar
would love to
nessa
help
segunda
you
joinha.
in a way that
Fique
I
à
can be
vontade.
useful.